Thank you very much. Thank you so much for getting up and getting here so early. And thank you for braving the notorious jihadi community of Rancho Mirage, about which we've heard so much. Let's hope we pull through. Of course, I mean, there is indisputably a faint whiff of controversy about what I want to talk about today, which essentially is to look at the origins of Islam, which in a sense means the origins of the Quran, as history. So not in terms of what Muslims traditionally have believed, but about what the historical record seems to me to tell us about how and why Islam came into existence. And the reason that I'm interested in this, I did not have a particular interest in Islam, but I did have an interest in the Roman Empire. And the rise of Islam is also the story of the fall of the Roman Empire in the East. Of course, the Roman Empire in the West, including Rome, falls in the 5th century AD. But in the eastern half, it continues to go strong. It is ruled from the New Rome, the Second Rome, the city founded by the first Christian emperor of Rome, Constantinople. And although we perhaps think of this Eastern Roman Empire as Byzantium, we call it the Byzantine Empire, that is not what the people who lived in Constantinople called it. They called it the Roman Empire. They saw themselves as Roman, albeit that they did it in Greek. They called themselves the Romaoi. So as well as being the heirs of Rome, there's a sense in which the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century AD is the heir of classical Greece as well. So in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the 6th century AD, it looks like the ancient world. The Greeks, the Romans, they're still going strong. And looking at the Fertile Crescent, so towards Iraq, towards Iran, there also the world looks recognizably ancient, because the great enemy of Rome in the 6th century AD, as it had been for 300 years, is a Persian Empire. The Persian Empire ruled by the House of Sassan, so it's called the Sasanian Empire. And this Persian Empire is self-consciously the heir of the first Persian Empire, the empire of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes, who had fought the Greeks at Thermopylae and Salamis. And that empire in turn was raised on foundations laid by the Babylonians, by the Assyrians, going right the way back to Samaria, to the very origins, really, of urban civilization in the Near East. So the combination of these two great empires, the Roman and the Persian, still going strong in the 6th century AD, it makes the world look like antiquity, like the ancient world. And then the traditional sense of what happens is that in the 7th century, everything changes. The traditional story is that a prophet emerges, he preaches a new religion, the Arabs erupt out of the desert, they've got the Quran in one hand, they've got the sword in the other. They're always sort of, that image, I always wonder how on earth did they then ride their camels if they were doing that. And basically, before you can say Allahu Akbar, the conquered provinces of the Roman and the Persian Empire in the Middle East have been transformed into stage sets from the Arabian Nights. And the Middle East has suddenly, kind of overnight, like switching on a light switch, has become medieval, it's become Muslim. And I think there is always in history a kind of temptation to imagine that things do change very, very rapidly. And it may be that, so things like the inauguration last week, it kind of gives you the sense that everything, Donald Trump comes in, Obama goes out, everything changes. But of course, you know that it doesn't. The continuities are, in a sense, far more significant than the changes. And going right the way back through American history, you can see that before and after the Civil War, profound changes, and yet the continuities are, in a sense, even more significant. likewise with the American Revolution, the continuity. I mean, that's why I can talk to you in English, after all. And so I think, when you pause to think about that, you recognize that. And so it seems apparent that this idea that with what people call the coming of Islam, beginning of the 7th century, everything changes, cannot be true. The process must have been a much, much longer one, much more protracted and complex one. But if that's the case, why do we have this sense so strongly that the coming of Islam changed everything, that it was an absolute rupture? Well, I think the answer to that, essentially, is the incredible potency of what Muslims have come to believe about the origin of their faith. Because it is really the stories that Muslims tell about how Islam came into being that provide the defining template for our understanding of this period. So that even non-Muslims, up until about 40 or 50 years ago, tended to take the traditional Muslim account of how Islam came into being for granted. And the story is a very powerful one. AD 610 by the Christian calendar, it is said, a merchant named Muhammad, in a cave above a remote and arid city named Mecca, in the depths of the Arabian desert, heard something as terrifying as it was awesome, the voice of an angel. And that voice delivered to him, direct and unmediated, a revelation from God. And it was the first in a whole series of revelations that would be delivered to Muhammad over the course of his lifetime. And these revelations, bundled together, would become the Quran, the holy text of this new emergent faith of Islam. And to Muslims, the divine origin of the Quran was manifest in the circumstances by which it came into being. The fact that it had been given supernaturally was the great foundational miracle of this new faith. Now, it is true, I think, that were you to read the Quran and not know this backstory, it would not be immediately obvious, I think, that the only explanation for how it came into being was that it had been delivered by an angel. There are quite a lot of elements within the Quran that point to its emergent from pre-existent religions and cultures. For instance, it is full of characters from the Bible, both the Jewish and the Christian Bible. Moses is mentioned 137 times in the Quran. The Virgin Mary is featured more prominently in the Quran than she is in the New Testament. It features as well a number of episodes drawn from the history of the Roman Empire and the culture of the Roman Empire. It describes a story of 7 Christians who go to sleep in a cave to escape a persecution, wake up, discover that 100 years have gone by and the whole world has become Christian. This story, distorted, appears in the Quran. There is even a mention of Alexander the Great. So I think that if you read the Quran and you do not know the backstory, you would think this is recognizably a text that has emerged from a given place and a given time. But there's a problem in following through the implications of that because of what Muslims tell us about how the Quran came into being. Because what the key factor about the traditional account is that Muhammad receives his first revelations in Mecca, and Mecca stands at a fabulous remove from the world of the Roman Empire, from this culture, this melting pot of Jewish and Christian and Roman traditions. Mecca, we are told, stood in the middle of a desert, and its inhabitants, we are also told, are pagan. According to Muslim tradition, there are no Jews, there are no Christians in Mecca. There were not communities from which Muhammad could have picked up these stories, according to the traditional Muslim account. And what is more, we are also told by Muslim tradition, despite the fact that actually it's contradicted within the Quran, but we're told in Muslim tradition that Muhammad was illiterate. So there was no prospect of him curling up with the Bible, picking up a few stories, a few references to Moses or the Virgin. And if that's the case, if Muhammad comes of age in a city that is pagan, that is 1,000 kilometers from the frontier with Palestine, if he is illiterate, then how on earth are we to explain this text, which is full of all these sophisticated cultural references, except as a bona fide miracle? It would seem, if we are to rely on the Muslim account of how the Quran came into being, that the divine must indeed have penetrated this mortal sublunar world of ours. And the parallel, I think, very interestingly, is with what Christians believe about the coming into the world of Christ. Because just as it is the blood and muscle of Mary's virgin womb that, in the opinion of Christians, had nurtured the coming into the world of Christ, so likewise, in the opinion of Muslims, was it the spreading, almost prophylactic sands of Arabia, which had served to preserve the Word of God over the course of its protracted delivery in a fit condition of untainted purity. In other words, just to sum up, to make the point clear, if the Muslim traditions that tell us about how the Quran came into being, where Muhammad grew up, what kind of city Mecca was, if those traditions are authentic, then there is essentially no way of explaining the origins of the Quran except as coming from some divine entity. Which, of course, is fine if you're a Muslim. But if you're not, you might well say, well, okay, these are interesting stories, interesting traditions. Where do they come from? What are their origin? What are their date? And this is where it gets interesting. Because I said that I didn't originally approach this topic as in any way a specialist in Islam. And so I had assumed, based on the fact that there are so many books published about the life of Muhammad, about the origins of Islam, that there would be an enormous amount of biographical material telling us about the life of Muhammad. There is a wonderful quote from Salman Rushdie, of all people, where he says about Muhammad, and he's comparing it to Jesus. He says, we know almost nothing about Jesus, but with Muhammad, we know everything, more or less. We know where he lived, what his economic situation was, who he fell in love with. We know what his favorite food was. We know how he liked to brush his teeth. We know how he liked to play with children. Incredibly intimate, personal details. But here's the rub. All this seeming wealth of biographical material dates, at the earliest, from about 2 centuries after he is supposed to have lived. From about AD 800, we start to get biographies. And over the course of the next 2 centuries, these biographies are written and rewritten. And the further from Muhammad's life we go, the more detailed these biographies become, which is a curious fact, and draws attention to the glaring lack of contemporary or even near contemporary biographical materials written by Muslims. So within the lifetime of Muhammad himself, and for about 170 years after, you look for this source material and there is nothing. There is a glaring black hole. Can black holes glare? I guess they can. Now, this is not to say, as some scholars have, mostly in Germany, because in Germany scholars like these kind of outre speculations, but Muhammad, I think, did exist. There are those who say he didn't, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that he did. And the evidence is not Muslim, but generally Christian. Christians writing about the emergence of an Arab empire do name-check Muhammad. I mean, the most tantalizing one is written in 634, which is the year that the Arabs first appear in Palestine, the Roman province of Palestine, conquering it, so the onslaught of the Arab invasions. And this describes an unnamed prophet of the Saracens leading the invasion. And this must be Muhammad. But again, there's a kind of puzzle here because Muhammad is meant to have died in 632. And according to Muslim tradition, he does not lead the invasion of Palestine. And yet here we have a contemporaneous account, it seems, saying that Muhammad was alive, that he did lead the invasion, and he's there 2 years after he's meant to be dead, which kind of pinpoints the problem with squaring the accounts from Muhammad's lifetime with the stories that are told about him by Muslims much later on. And over the succeeding decades, so over the course of the 7th century, we do have histories written by monks, bishops, Christian chroniclers, a few rabbis, a few Zoroastrian priests, which do allude to an enigmatic figure whom they describe variously as the general or the instructor or the king of the Arabs. And I think we, again, can assume that this figure is probably Muhammad. But these cryptic allusions, not to mention the fact that they're not being made by Muslims, that they're being made by infidels, again highlights this peculiar absence, this absence of any Muslim references to Muhammad. And it's only in 690, so that's 60 years and more after the first Arab invasions of Palestine, that an Arab ruler finally gets round to inscribing the Prophet's name on a public monument. It's the Dome of the Rock on what is now Temple Mount, the one with the great golden dome. And it's only decades after that that we start to get private inscriptions written in Arabic that mention Muhammad. And I think the implication of that is that clearly the promotion of Muhammad as a figure worthy of respect is top-down. It's being promoted by the kind of people who are building the Dome of the Rock. It's not rising up from the soil. And as I say, it's only in 800 that we start to get biographies written of Muhammad that have survived into the present day. There must have been earlier versions of his life, but they have vanished. And I think it's pretty clear why they have vanished when you read the very earliest biography of Muhammad that survived, written by a guy writing in Cairo called Ibn Hisham. He's absolutely upfront about the process of editing that he has done to write his biography. And he says that things which it is disgraceful to discuss, matters which would distress certain people, and such reports as I have been told are not to be accepted as trustworthy, all these things have I omitted. So he's basically saying anything that doesn't fit his understanding of who and what Muhammad was, he's got rid of them. And what that was, we have no idea because it hasn't survived. So here we have a measure of certainty. We can know with confidence that by the early 9th century, the precise details of what Muhammad was believed to have said and done some 200 years previously had come to provide for vast numbers of people from the Atlantic to the frontiers of China, come to provide a roadmap that these people believed led to heaven. They believed that God had seized personal control of world affairs, that the world had been set upon an utterly novel course, that in the lifetime of Muhammad there had indeed been a drastic and utter rupture with the world that had existed before that, and that therefore no explanation was needed for the origins of Islam and for the collapse before the Arab armies of the Roman and the Persian empires that did not ultimately derive from God. And in the 10th century, a Muslim historian who was who was writing about the conquests, exulting in them, saying that it demonstrated how God had indeed favored the Muslims. He described how they had conquered the Roman and the Persian empires. We went to meet them with small abilities and weak forces, and God made us triumph and gave us possession of their territories. And such an explanation for the rise of the Arab Empire to Muslim scholars in the 10th century and from then onwards appeared more than adequate. Now, of course, to historians who are not Muslim, and particularly to historians who have been raised in a kind of secular tradition, post-Enlightenment tradition, a tradition that you do not look to the supernatural, you do not look to the divine to explain why things have happened, that you explain religion in terms of human motivation rather than divine authority. Just saying, well, it happened because God wanted it to happen, is inadequate as an explanation. And so that's why, over the past few decades, really since the 1970s, when scholars try to understand how and why it was that a Christian Roman Near East became a Muslim Arab one, they turn for explanations not so much as historians used to do in the West, to the biographies of Muhammad, to the histories, to the commentaries on the Quran, written by pious Muslims centuries after the events they describe, but to the context of the world into which Islam was born. A world that is called by scholars late antiquity. So it's the world, it's the late autumn of the ancient world, when the leaves are starting to turn yellow, starting to fall from the trees. Not an illusion I know makes no sense here whatsoever, but to those of you from New England, I hope you know what I mean. Now, to explore the way in which Islam might have derived from the world of late antiquity is a huge topic, and it would require an entire book to explore it. And by great good fortune, such a book does exist and is, I believe, available for sale after this talk. But just perhaps to tempt you and persuade you that it might be worth investing your dollars in this book, I thought in the time left I'd cover just some of the areas in which I think it makes sense to see the coming of Islam not as a clean break with what had gone before, not as a kind of guillotine dropping on the neck of the ancient world, but rather as a kind of bloom sprung from its seedbed. And as we all know, as I said at the beginning, as was broadcast in the newspaper coverage of this talk, it is a sensitive business. And that being so, I will leave the more combustible propositions to the end and begin not with the religious dimensions of the replacement of the Roman and Persian empires with an Arab one, but with the geopolitical one. And I think that there are sort of interesting echoes here of what is happening in the Middle East at the moment. The traditional narrative, as I said, has the Arabs erupting from the depths of the desert. These are warriors who are pristine, who are pure, who are untainted by contact with the corrupt empires in the Fertile Crescent. But this is not true. The facts are vastly more complex and vastly more interesting. And if we want to understand what happened when the Arabs conquered the Roman and the Persian empires, we need to look at the whole history of the Roman Empire, West as well as East, because the challenge for emperors right from the heyday of the Roman Empire was to control the frontiers, particularly in the West, so along the Rhine, along the Danube. The lands beyond these frontiers was not worth the effort of conquering. And so what the Romans did was to establish garrisons, to establish frontiers, and every so often they would send punitive expeditions out to beat up the natives. But it was kind of easier, basically, to hand out bribes, to employ the natives beyond the frontier as mercenaries, basically to pay these tribal leaders to behave themselves. And gradually, over the course of the centuries, the result of this was that these, what had previously been scattered tribal entities, began to cohere. They became richer, they had absorbed Roman military techniques, and in the 5th century, when the Roman Empire imploded into civil war, these tribal communities had become sufficiently Roman, had become sufficiently effective as fighting and civic forces that they were able to cross the frontier and essentially take command of what had been the Roman provinces. Now, that doesn't happen in the East because in the desert there are not enough nomads, there are not enough Bedouin to do this. And that's one of the reasons why the Roman Empire in the East survives when the Roman Empire in the West does not. And that enables the Roman emperors in the 6th century from Constantinople. They retain a sufficient military base that they can contemplate reconquering the West. And under the greatest emperor, Justinian, who builds the mighty cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which still stands there, one of the great buildings of the world, it looks as if the Roman Empire is making a comeback. Roman armies reconquer North Africa, Sicily, Italy, even bits of Spain. You know, it looks as if Rome is indeed going to be made great again. But then a series of catastrophes overwhelms the Roman Empire in the East. In 541, a devastating plague breaks out. It begins in Egypt and it spreads with a devastating rapidity east and west. And there's been a lot of debate about how bad it was. Contemporary sources say that anything up to a half the population of the world died. And people had always thought that this was an exaggeration. But about a decade ago, corpses of people who had died in Germany of this plague were found and were discovered to have died of Black Death, of the plague. So the implication of that is that the impact of this plague in the mid-6th century would have been even greater than that of the Black Death, in which a third of the population of Europe died. So utterly devastating. And particularly devastating for the Romans because they were an urban civilization. And cities are always incubators of disease, far more than deserts. And the corollary of this was noted by a Roman commander who observed that while the empire's once countless military units have dwindled in number, the plague, that ally of war, has not so much touched the rancorous tribes of the desert. So what you have is, almost for the first time, a sense that there is a balance of power between the nomads of the desert and the armed forces governing the settlements of the Fertile Crescent. And what makes it worse for the Romans is that the plague has also, as well as destroying the military base, it has also destroyed the taxation base. There isn't enough money to keep things going. And so there's this kind of massive process of closing everything down, roads, fortifications, garrisons. And in the Fertile Crescent, what happens is that the Romans essentially mothball their fortifications along the frontier with the desert, along the Palestinian and Syrian border. And these citadels, these fortresses, are abandoned to jackals and to weeds and to hermits. And the defense of that line is subcontracted out to Arab mercenaries. And the Arab mercenaries are imported into the military infrastructure of Palestine and Syria and installed there to provide the Roman Empire with their defenses. And the same things happens in the Persian Empire along Iraq. Because what both the Persians and the Romans are doing is focusing on the main enemy, which is one another. So the military frontier between the Persian and the Roman empires, through what is now northern Syria, northern Iraq, up into what is now Turkey, that is the focus. And the consequence of this is that in the early 7th century, the ancient world's equivalent of the Black Death is followed by the ancient world's equivalent of the First World War. A devastating conflict breaks out between the Roman and the Persian empires. You know, a Cold War had been going for centuries, but this is absolutely devastating. And the war lasts for decades. And although it's the Romans who ultimately emerge victorious, there was a point where it looked as if the entire empire would go under. For a generation, Syria, Palestine, Jerusalem, Egypt fall under Persian occupation. the greatest treasure in the Roman Empire, the cross on which Jesus is believed to have been crucified, is stolen from Jerusalem and taken as a trophy of war back to Iraq. And for the Arabs, the implications of this are immense, because suddenly the supply of gold that their paymasters in Constantinople had been paying them has been cut off. So they too are embroiled in this cataclysm. So you have war, you have plague, you have financial collapse, and this is a period when everybody in the Near East takes for granted that things that happen because God wants them to happen. And looking around them, rather as they're doing today, Islamic State is a highly apocalyptic cult. And they're apocalyptic because when they read the Quran, they find in the Quran a deeply apocalyptic strain. And so I think it is well worth asking, was the origins of the Quran this sense that everything is about to end, that God, in the words of the Quran, is about to roll up the scroll of creation and put it away? Is this background of war and famine and plague and financial collapse, is this the motor? Is this the explanation? Was Muhammad, just as monks were, just as rabbis were, just as Zoroastrian priests were, looking around him at the chaos of the age and thinking, what is going on here? What is God's purpose? And I think it is. And I think that there are clues within the Quran that point to this as an explanation. Now, those of you who have not read the Quran, but who may be familiar with the Bible, the Quran is nothing like the Bible. The Bible is full of name checks all kinds of great powers and famous people, from Cyrus the Great to Caesar Augustus. These people are not. There is only one geopolitical power name checked in the Quran. That's the Romans. One verse. And it says the Romans have been defeated in a nearby land, and yet after their defeat they shall be victorious in a few years. It seems likely that this is a reference to the Great War between the Romans and the Persians, and suggests that this is big news for whoever the author or authors of the Quran are. And there is another echo of the war in the story that is told of Alexander the Great in the Quran. Alexander is not he's not named, but it's recognizably him. He's called Dukungan, which means the horned one. And coins that were issued in the wake of Alexander's death showed him with the curling ram horns of Amun, the king of the Egyptian gods. So that's an astonishing thought, that in the Quran there seems to be an allusion to the king of the old Egyptian gods. Amazing. What is he doing there? Well, this goes back to the story of how the Romans recaptured the true cross from the Persians. When Heraclius, the Roman emperor, who in an astonishing military comeback defeated the Persians, he took the true cross and he escorted it back to Jerusalem, and he installed it back in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And in celebration of this, a man in Syria wrote a story in which Alexander does much the same. Alexander is described as going eastwards. He defeats the Persians. He goes to the limits of the world. He walls up tribes called Gog and Magog, who are so repellent that they think nothing of snacking on puppies, the bastards. He walls them up behind great gates of brass, and there they will remain until the end of days. And then he speaks to Christ, and he says that he's going to take his throne and take it back to Jerusalem and set it up there, ready for Christ to sit in. And it's evident that this story is inspired by Heraclius taking the cross. And this story appears almost word for word in the Quran, except that anything that is reminiscent of Christian or Roman propaganda is removed. But in the Quran, Dukungan, Alexander, likewise, heads eastwards. He confronts Gog and Magog. He walls them up behind gates of brass. But as I say, there is no mention of Jesus or of Rome in this. And the reason for that is that in the Quran, empires, worldly powers are merely the gusting of grains of sand upon desert winds. For every nation, the Quran says, there is an appointed span of time. When their time arrives, they can neither delay it nor bring it forward, even for an instant. So the clues are sketchy, but I think they do seem to suggest that the Quran, certainly in the form that we have it, so the final form, was indeed uttered by someone, presumably Muhammad. I mean, if Muhammad didn't exist, we'd have to invent him, in the period that Muslim tradition has always insisted that he lived. And that's great, because historically that then means that you can use the Quran as evidence for what some, at least, of the Arabs in the early 7th century thought they were about, thought was going on. But can we push it further? Can we conclude from this that everything that Muslim tradition says about Muhammad and the Quran is therefore true? Well, no, because the familiar problem remains, and the glaring problem is this, that if what the biographies of Muhammad tell us are true, and Mecca was an inveterately pagan city, devoid of any Jewish or Christian presence, situated in the midst of a vast untenanted desert, then how are we to account for the abrupt appearance there of a fully fledged monotheism, complete with references to Abraham, to Moses, and to Jesus? And this is the problem. And essentially, ever since Western historians began writing about the origins of Islam, this is the problem that they have had to wrestle with. And various explanations have been proposed, of which the most popular is that Mecca was somehow at the center of a great spice trade. It was kind of the Dubai of its day. And that Muhammad was a trader, and he went up, in trains of camels, and he went to Jerusalem, and he went to Damascus, and he kind of picked up, he heard rabbis and he heard Christian priests, and he picked up all this Moses, Jesus stuff, and then he just bunged it into the Quran. This is inadequate as an explanation. And it's inadequate for a number of reasons. Firstly, the relationship of the Quran to the Jewish and Christian scriptures is far more sophisticated. There are a lot of very, very sophisticated echoes in it. This is not a guy who is just overhearing something about Moses and putting it in. But more complex and more fascinatingly, it's evident that just from the evidence of the Quran, that Muhammad's opponents are not pagan. Muslim tradition says they're pagan. But when you read the Quran, it's a very disputatious text. It's basically God or the Prophet arguing with people who are called the mushrikun. And the mushrikun are the pagans of Muslim tradition. But from the evidence of the Quran, it's evident that they too are monotheists, that they too know who Abraham and Moses and Jesus are, and that essentially what is being argued about is the nature of God, not the fact that there is only a single God. So it would seem that the Quran, and therefore presumably Muhammad, is emerging from a culture that is steeped in a kind of biblical monotheism. And what's oddest of all is that many of the traditions, the Christian traditions in particular, that are being cited are very ancient. So there are all kinds of echoes and allusions to gospels that had been banned by the Catholic Church that had come to power under Constantine. Texts that we only know of because they've been dug up in Egyptian deserts, and yet you find echoes of them preserved within the Quran. There are even, it seems, echoes of texts that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there seem to be kind of, it's almost like the Quran is a wall of sediment in which fossils have been embedded. And what are they doing there? Where have these ancient texts come from? And it's very, very mysterious. But it's clear, I think, that the Quran, far from originating, at a remove from this world, is like a kind of enormous lake into which all kinds of streams, all kinds of traditions are flowing and mixing and certainly creating something new, but the constituent elements clearly come from the ancient Near East. And that begs the obvious problem. Well, what is going on here? How can the Quran have emerged in this way if what Muslim tradition says about Mecca is true? And I think the answer, the way you cut the Gordian knot, is actually to say the Quran did not originate from Mecca, or at least Mecca that we, in Saudi Arabia, where it is now, where Muslims go on pilgrimage. Basically, they're going on pilgrimage to the wrong place, I think, is the implication. This is where I duck. The evidence seems to me, and certainly not just to me, I am building this on the back of a lot of great scholarship. But the evidence seems to me to point to an origin for the Quran to the north of Mecca, basically along the desert frontier of Roman Palestine. You remember that verse I read out about the Romans have been fighting in a nearby land. The implication of that is that it's a nearby land, that the guy who is writing this is on the frontier of Palestine. But also, if you wanted one place in the world in the early 7th century, there would have been old Christian and Jewish traditions preserved. It would have been the deserts beyond the Holy Land, because the Holy Land for Jews and for Christians is a place where traditions are preserved. And as both Jewish and Christian orthodoxy becomes more and more punitive and heretics are pushed out to the limits, they have nowhere to go except out into the Palestinian deserts. So if you wanted to find Jewish and Christian texts that have otherwise vanished from the Roman world in the early 7th century, the one place I think you would go would be the desert fringes beyond Palestine. Now, the obvious stumbling block here, of course, is, well, what about Mecca? Why do Muslims end up thinking that Muhammad came from Mecca? And again, the solution to this puzzle, I think, lies in the Quran, lies in reading the Quran, not in the context of what Muslims say about it, but just nakedly as a text in its own terms. And when you look at that, you find something very strange. The first is that there is only one mention of Mecca in the whole of the Quran. And it is not at all clear what Mecca is. It might be a city, it might be a village. It seems likely it's actually to be a valley. It seems to be a description of a valley. Only one mention. And then you look at other ancient texts for a mention of Mecca, and the earliest datable reference to Mecca outside of the Quran, when do you think it is? 741. So more than 100 years after Muhammad is supposed to have died. And do you know where Mecca is placed in this text that mentions it in 741? The deserts of Iraq. Not placed in Arabia at all. And then you look at the descriptions of the mushrikun, the opponents of Muhammad, the people who, according to Muslim tradition, are meant to have lived in Mecca. They are described as agriculturalists. They're described as farmers. They're keeping cattle. They're growing olives. They're tending vines. There are no cattle in Mecca. There are no vines. There are no olives. It was impossible for the olive that grew at that time to be grown in that far in Arabia. It was a Mediterranean crop. So the evidence seems to point to the strong likelihood that the opponents of Muhammad, at the very least, are living in a Mediterranean region. And then there is one final, I think, clinching clue, because just as the Quran does not mention great powers, great people, so also does it not really mention recognizable geographical locations. There are only 7 place names mentioned in the Quran. But there does seem to be one key pointer to where the mushrikun, and therefore by extension Muhammad, lived. And it derives from the story of Lot in the book of Genesis. You remember Lot is the nephew of Abraham, and he goes to live in the city of Sodom, and the Sodomites offend God for all kinds of reasons and are wiped out. And Lot and his family escape, his wife looks back and gets turned into a pillar of salt. And this appears in a kind of refracted way in the Quran. This is God speaking. Remember when we delivered Lot and all his household, except for an old woman who was left behind. Then we destroyed the others, i.e. the Sodomites. You pass by them morning and night. Will you not understand? You pass by them, the Sodomites, morning and night. So where were the Sodomites to be seen? Well, we know exactly where the Sodomites were to be seen because in the early 7th century there was a chapel built to Lot on the site. It's on the southernmost tip of the Dead Sea, between what is now Israel and Jordan. And so if the Mushrikun are passing these people day and night, then the implication of that is where Muhammad is having his arguments with the Mushrikun that are recorded in the Quran. And I think this is entirely fitting because Islam, like Judaism, like Christianity, is described as Abrahamic religions. Abraham, the legends that are associated with Abraham in late antiquity were focused on the promised land, so Palestine, and in the deserts that lay beyond it. There are no traditions whatsoever in antiquity of Abraham going to where Mecca is now. He, his children, his concubines operated in the deserts beyond Palestine. And so I think that is the place to look for the origins of Islam. And it suggests strongly, I think, that the Quran, far from standing at some fantastical remove from the currents and convulsions of the age, is in fact the supreme monument to them. Thank you very much. The question is, what is the attitude of the Quran to other religions? Very topical because it's having a measurable impact on the lives of people in the Middle East at the moment. The answer to that is that the Quran is well aware of the existence of other religions, and it's aware of the fact that the Jews and the Christians have the same prophets. And so the Quran mandates that Jews, Christians, and a mysterious people called the Sabaeans must be tolerated. They must be allowed to practice their religion as they wish, but that they must acknowledge their inferiority in exchange. So they must pay a tax called the jizya, and as they pay the jizya, they must bow their heads and acknowledge their submission. Everyone else, bad news. Pagans, they have to go. And the problem for people in the Middle East and indeed beyond, who are not Christian and Jewish, is that if you interpret the Quran literally, they are lined up for extermination. And basically since the 19th century, Muslims have not taken those mandates literally. What's happened with the Islamic State is that they have begun to take those mandates literally again. So I've just been making a film about how Islamic State is, and went to Iraq and spoke to various Yazidis and Christians. And it's evident that Islamic State interpret these verses in the most brutal and violent way possible, but that they do, having said that, treat Christians and Yazidis, for instance, differently. So the demand that Christians pay the jizya is interpreted as a license to extort and strip Christians of everything. So when ISIS moved into Mosul, they essentially took over all Christian property and expelled the Christians, but they didn't kill them. When they came to the Yazidis, who have a kind of strange, to our eyes, strange religion, they were condemned as mushrikun, as pagans. And verses were interpreted to mean that the men had to be exterminated and the women were liable to become slaves. And it is frankly, I wrote Shadow of the Sword, the book that my talk has been based on, before the rise of Islamic State, and it never crossed my mind as I was writing it that I would witness scenes comparable to what I had been writing about as a description of the 7th century, armies sweeping across deserts, destroying idols, taking slaves, practicing genocide. I would never have imagined it. And that is why, again, I say that this is in one level ancient history, but it is also lethally contemporary history as well. And the understanding of this material, it's like approaching a fissile material in a nuclear reactor. It has to be handled with extreme care. Yes, sir. And then, no, as I say, Christians are tolerated. And indeed, there is a sense in which the more Christians you have, the richer you are, because you screw money out of them. And it was always a financial problem for various Muslim states. When you're a Christian, you're paying an enormous amount of tax. The obvious solution is to become a Muslim. And that really is why so many Christians in the Caliphate, in the medieval period, converted to Islam. And it was always a massive problem, because one day the vizier would come to the caliph and say, we haven't got any Christians left. Yes. Well, it does. As I say, it appears on the Dome of the Rock in 690. And from that point on, Muhammad's name does appear in various inscriptions. And then it's really only the biographies, the detailed accounts of his life. The whole idea of the Arabs being an entirely nomadic people that had nothing to do with civilization, which is so important to traditional account, is not true. They were deeply embedded in the fabric of the Roman and the Persian empires as mercenaries. They had entire kingdoms. One of the Arab kings in the 6th century was a consul of the Roman people. These were highly, highly Romanized people. And that, I think, is really the explanation for what happens, is that just as in Western Europe, barbarian leaders are barbarian. They're not calling themselves Roman, but they are dressing themselves up in Roman robes. They're building Roman buildings when they can, because Rome is the archetype of power. So in the same way, that's what the Muslims, or the Arabs who become the Muslims, I don't think that something called Islam comes into being until about 850, really. 750, sorry. What they are doing is manufacturing a religion that explains why God has given them this vast empire. And that evolves over time. It's basically a kind of, it's the equivalent of manifest destiny. The notion that God has given, the sweep of the continental America to the United States is so important in the 19th century to provide, it justifies Americans in pushing westwards and coming to California and taking land from Mexico. If you're just nicking stuff, that's not good enough. You've got to say God wants you to have it. And that basically is what Islam evolves as. I have to stop there, but I will answer your question afterwards. Yang nagbawangan dari kabawan, kepalanya sungsang, otaknya diselangkang. Surganya cuma batang yang mencari lubang, selalu mimpi disayang oleh para dayang. Hidungnya belang, mulutnya lancang, suka menantang, dengan muka garang, tidak bisa menang. Kalau tidak curang, sering dapat uang, menggunakan parang, tapi ngaku dagang di tanah abang. Pengetahuannya kurang, nuraninya hilang, percaya Tuhan yang berhutang, untuk Nabi berperang, suka barang benci semua orang, merampok para tukang yang bekerja di ladang, memperbudak bujang dan perempuan yang malang, baju putih dia pasang lalu pergi ke simpang, ibadahnya adalah nampang supaya dikira nyumbang, dongeng dia pegang, sejarah dia buang. Orang bawang yang sedang tegang, jangan kamu girang, jangan
Jadi tobatlah sekarang sebelum kesempatanmu melayang. Orang bawang yang sedang tegang, jangan kamu girang, jangan kamu senang. Tidak ada gamang, tidak ada bimbang. Gerakan kamu datang, disiksa sampai ke tulang. Di atas seutas bendamu akan dipanggang sampai waktu yang panjang dan tidak terbilang. Hukumanmu seimbang dengan dosamu yang gadang jika kamu tidak pulang dari jalan pedang. Jadi tobatlah sekarang sebelum kesempatanmu melayang.